So I'm here with 15 minutes to talk to you guys about a 900-page novel that has more than 350 footnotes, some of which go on for pages and pages and pages at a time. So we'll see how this goes. The book is David Foster Wallace's Infinite Jest, and this book was published in 1996. It's sort of a mildly dystopian story set roughly in around 2010. North America has become one big giant continent. The continent has become one big giant nation. A big portion of it has become a garbage dump known as the Great Convexity, which is populated by giant feral hamsters. It's a world where corporations purchase naming rights for years. So instead of 2008, 2009, 2010, you have the year of the trial-sized Dove bar, the year of Glad, the year of the Tux medicated pad. Most of the book actually takes place in the year of the Depend adult undergarment. The book is simultaneously laugh-out-loud funny, deeply human, and deeply tragic. And if you have to ask what it's kind of about a tennis academy. It's kind of about a rehab house. It's kind of about a terroristic plot. It's definitely kind of about addiction. And it's kind of about this lethal videotape that if you watch it, you die. But most of all, it's about a father and a son. The father's name is James Incandenza. He's this art house filmmaker. He's the founder of a tennis academy. And he has a son named Hal. Hal's this tennis superstar. He's a verbal prodigy. By the time he's 10, 11 years old, he's memorizing whole sections of the Oxford English Dictionary. But Hal is also totally out of touch with his emotions, totally out of touch with what he's feeling in his life, and totally unable to connect with other people, especially with his father. So there's this gap, and the father wants to close it. At age 11, he concocts this elaborate plot where he says, we're going to send you off to a conversationalist. He's like, is it a therapist? And he's like, no, it's a conversationalist. We want you to talk to this conversationalist. And he shows up, and he starts talking with this guy, and Hal's brilliant, and immediately sort of outsmarts the conversationalist, and realizes when the guy's nose starts to melt off his face that this is just his father in an elaborate disguise trying to get his son to talk to him. In hopes of connecting several years later, he makes this film that gives the book its title. Wallace writes, he spent the last 90 days of his animate life working tirelessly to contrive a medium, the film, via which he and the muted son could simply converse, to concoct something that the gifted boy couldn't simply master and move on to a new plateau, something the boy would love enough to induce him to open his mouth and come out, even if it was only to ask for more. Make something so compelling that it would reverse thrust on a young self's fall into the womb of solipsism, anhedonia, death, and life. A magically entertaining toy to dangle at the infant that was somewhere still alive in the boy, to make his eyes light and his toothless mouth open unconsciously, to laugh, to bring him out of himself, as they say. The womb could be used both ways, a way to say, I am so very, very sorry, and have it heard. He goes on a little later to say, any conversation or interchange is better than none at all. The worst kind of gut-wrenching intergenerational interface is better than withdrawal or hiddenness on both sides. So he makes this mind-crushingly entertainment film, and it turns out that it's lethal. Once you see it, it's all you ever want to do again. There's no interest in food, no interest in water. You're incapacitated, and if you have to stop watching it, you go mad and you die. The father, shortly after completing it, kills himself by elaborately setting up a microwave so that he can microwave his own head. He later appears in the book as a ghost or a wraith who continues to haunt his son with the same goal of trying to draw him out and get him to communicate. The opening scene of the book is actually the end. Hal is in this college entrance interview, and he's got his tennis coach on one side and his schoolmaster on the other. His father's been dead for several years, and his guardians here won't let him speak. So they're interviewing him, and these guys are answering for him. Well, finally, he's forced to speak. And when he does, he has none of the trouble that his father worries about earlier in the book. He isn't numb. He isn't disconnected from his thoughts and emotions. He says, I'm not just a boy who plays tennis. I have an intricate history, experiences and feelings. I'm complex. I read. I study and read. I do things like get in a taxi and say, the library, and step on it. I'm not a machine. I feel and believe. And yet, while Hal's thoughts are clear, no one hears him. The sounds that come out of his mouth are terrifying, variously described as barely mammalian, Like a drowning goat, a goat drowning in something viscous, like a stick of butter being hit with a mallet. One of them says, the integrity of my sleep has been forever compromised. In other words, everyone freaks out, and they variously try to help him, thinking maybe he's choking, maybe something's wrong, and then they try to restrain him, thinking that he's gone insane. It's shortly after that scene that we see the flashback to his father posing as the conversationalist, Hal, verbally brilliant, but emotionally guarded in a way that devastates his dad. So you have this gap between a father and a son, and a father who goes to wild ends to try and breach it, kills himself, and then haunts his son, trying to get him to nonetheless feel something. And it happens. Something happens. Something happens, and Hal, distant, detached, becomes the kid who says, I'm not a machine. I feel and believe. But somehow, in bridging the gap between Hal and his own emotions, another one opens up between Hal and the rest of the world. Now he can comprehend himself, and he knows what he feels, and he knows what he thinks. But no one else can. He's lost, and he's terrifying. As I've already said, addiction is a major theme in the story. Hal has a marijuana addiction, and there's a whole series of characters that are addicted to all kinds of drugs and to alcohol and to weird sexual behaviors. The tape itself is kind of a super drug. Once you watch the video, you obsess over getting more of it. You're dead to the world until you're literally dead. And this is the power of all drugs, the power of any drug. It's the ability to change our reality. It draws us in and it allows us to escape it. It allows us to disconnect. They're a means of avoiding pain. In an interview about the book, Wallace said, the book isn't supposed to be about drugs or getting off drugs. In fact, except as the fact that drugs are a kind of metaphor for the sort of addictive continuum that I think has to do with how we as a culture relate to things. We're absolutely dying to give ourselves away to something, to run, to escape somehow. Wallace sees the drugs as a metaphor for the addictive nature of entertainment and culture. And he saw this in 1996, before Facebook. He said the technology is going to get better and better at doing what it does, which is seduce us into being incredibly dependent on it so that advertisers can be more confident that we will watch their ads. This challenge in this kind of world is how we connect. As Wallace put it, we've got to figure out how to just be together in the same room. In other words, drugs in the book are a stand-in for the way that we all, like Hal, disconnect and create distance from one another in the world. There's a long aside in the book that I think illustrates it brilliantly. Again, long before Skype, long before FaceTime, Wallace predicted the rise and fall of the video phone. He says that the real coffin nail for video phones involved the way callers' faces looked on their screen during calls. Not their callers' faces, but their own when they saw them on the video. This sort of appearance check was no more resistible than a mirror, but the experience proved almost universally horrifying. To deal with the anxiety of having to look at yourself on the screen, people began to wear these high-definition silicone masks. You could slip it on as soon as the phone rang. One can slip these on, and you could suddenly appear as a put-together and raptly attentive version of yourself. Soon the market began to demand masks that were really quite a lot better looking than the actual person. After this, masks are supplanted by transmittable tableaus, which, he writes, were essentially a heavily doctored still photograph, one of an incredibly fit and attractive and well-turned-out human being, someone who actually resembled the caller only in such limited respects as, like, race and limb number. People eventually woke up to how absurd this was, and video phones were abandoned. And we're a long way away from transmittable tableaus, but we do live in an age where we're obsessed with selfies, where apps like Facetune and Pixter will make your face look more symmetrical, your skin look smoother, your teeth whiter. Apps like Skinny Pics and Skinny Cam will make you appear 10 pounds lighter. And if digital enhancement isn't enough, you can get something called the FaceTime facelift, a plastic surgery procedure that's designed to make your face look better when you point your own phone at it. I swear I am not making this up. Wallace looks at the world, and it's a place of tremendous addiction and tremendous discomfort. And the beauty of the book is the way that it makes you realize how normal all of that is. Great art has a way of making you feel like you're not alone. And if you're struggling with anxiety, depression, fear, addiction, discomfort, Wallace's book is profoundly liberating. And frankly, the kind of pain avoidance that Wallace describes isn't the exclusive territory of the non-Christian world. For example, When's the last time you prayed or sang or heard a psalm or heard a sermon about Psalm 88? Here's the last 4 verses of that psalm. From my youth I've suffered and been close to death. I've borne your terrors and am in despair. Your wrath has swept over me. Your terrors have destroyed me. All day long they surround me like a flood. You have completely engulfed me. You have taken from me friend and neighbor. Darkness is my closest friend. That's the end of the psalm. It doesn't get better from there. And I think we avoid this prayer because it is a colossal bummer. But of all people on earth, Christians, people who believe that Genesis 3 happened, people like us should be the people who are willing to acknowledge and embrace the reality of the pain and the darkness that's in the world. Life gives us the choice of praying this prayer in the darkness of our days or numbing ourselves and distracting ourselves away from it. There is no third option. And I think that language is a language that if we master, it might make us, like Hal, seem alien to the rest of the world. But it's also a language that just might heal us and just might lead us to true joy. This is why I think Infinite Jest, with all of its exploration of pain, of suffering, of addiction and disconnection, belongs in a conversation about joy. Because true joy only comes when we deal with the messy, dark reality of our lives. It unmasks false joy, so much of the happy activity in our days that isn't about the joy of those experiencing, but about masking our sorrows. We distract ourselves with entertainment, with sex, with busyness, with work. We hide in these things. We accept something less than joy in exchange for relief from anxiety, insecurity, and pain. But the truth is that we have to stop hiding from those things and allow them to come to the surface if we want to experience real joy. As Wallace put it, sometimes human beings have to just sit in one place and hurt. We have to confront our reality and the sadness that accompanies with it. And if you want to be free from these deeper pains, you have to sit and hurt. Another thing Wallace said about this, he said, the truth will set you free, but not until it's finished with you. Wallace is hopeful that by stopping numbing, by allowing the pain of being human to take up residence in our lives, there's some kind of hope. There's the possibility of connecting with people and of coming to a kind of peace with ourselves. And I think that's true, but I want to deepen it, because in Jesus we meet a man of sorrows, someone who is somehow able to take up all of our own sorrows in himself. It doesn't mean that our pain goes away, but rather that we find a God in that pain, a God who meets us in the midst of it. For example, look at the story of Job. God met Job in the midst of his sorrow and his loss, but he didn't give Job answers and relief. He met him and he overwhelmed him with a kaleidoscopic vision of creation. And in the end, without answering a single one of Job's questions, Job is happy. Why? Because God showed up. And the lesson of Job is this: we think we need answers to our problems, answers and solutions to our suffering in order to have joy. And the truth is, we need a God who shows up in the midst of our sorrows. John 11 probably makes that point more clearly than anywhere when Jesus shows up at the death of Lazarus, a tragedy that was wholly avoidable had Jesus just shown up a few days earlier. But he shows up in the midst of the pain, in the midst of the loss. He mourns with the mourners, and in the shortest of verses, we see that Jesus wept. The reality is that in a fallen world, we're never going to be pain-free, and perhaps until all things are made new, it's actually better that way, because our darkness and our pain are a place where we find that God meets us. Infinite Jest shows us the futility and the destructiveness of trying to drown out our pain, and the gospel invites us to step into it in all of its ugliness and to find Jesus there to meet us. Because true joy comes not from the absence of pain, but from the presence of God in the midst of it. Thank you.